Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Now, you may not be able to tell on camera, but I'm kind of a tall person. So, I have a vested interest in the tall people of the Bible. There's the Canaanites who strike fear into the Israelite spies. There's most famously Goliath, the Philistine warrior. And then there's the topic of today's video, the Nephilim. Now, why do all the tall people end up being evil is beyond me. I promise I'm a nice guy. Anyway, the Nephilim. What are they? What are they not? Where do they come from? Where do they go? And what are we supposed to make of them? I'm sure those of you who are familiar with the Bible, and maybe even those who aren't as familiar with it, have heard of the Nephilim. These giant demigods wandered the earth before the catastrophic flood in Genesis 7. The passage in Genesis 6 where they show up has confused and fascinated readers of the Bible for a very long time. And understandably, it's generated a lot of different interpretations. Some good and some not so good. Today we're focusing on Genesis 6, and we're going to see what the Nephilim might be and how they may have been understood in their original context. Now, a few caveats before we dive in. The term Nephilim appears twice, possibly 3 times in the Bible. The first place is in Genesis 6, and then again in Numbers 13, where the word is used to describe the inhabitants of the Promised Land before the Israelites settled it. Most scholars would suggest that the Numbers passage is dependent on Genesis 6, or that at least if we understand the Genesis 6 passage, we can make better sense of the passage in Numbers. Now, basically, to understand the rhetoric of Numbers 13, you need to understand what the Nephilim were in Genesis 6. Also, we'll reference a number of extra-biblical stories, and we aren't going to stop and explain all of those because we just don't have time, but we encourage you to check those out later. We'll link translations to those stories down in the description. So, with all that said, what in the world were the Nephilim? All right, let's start with the data that we have. Genesis 6. We're going to look at verses 1 through 8, and we'll read from the NIV translation, as this is one of the more common English translations and what most people will have available. It reads, "When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. But I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." Well, there it is. Clear as mud, right? What do we make of this? Well, the one thing that is seemingly universally agreed upon is that some transgression occurs between the sons of God and the daughters of men. But that's about all people agree on. Who these figures are and how the Nephilim relate to this transgression is not clear. It's not clear if the Nephilim were the offspring of these unions or if the time when the Nephilim were on the earth is the time when these unions took place. So, who are these people? Let's start by looking at how some of the key elements of this passage have been understood over time.
The key to understanding this passage has long been understood to be the phrase, the sons of God, or in Hebrew, Bnei Elohim. Who these characters are will impact how we understand a lot of this passage, including the Nephilim. The rarity of the word Nephilim in the Hebrew text means these various interpretations we'll look at rely on particular understandings of the words and phrases used in this passage, particularly the sons of God. So they use primarily interbiblical references for support. It seems that the first understanding of the Bnei Elohim is that they were angelic, or more accurately, supernatural beings. The crossing of boundaries between divine and human, or intermixing categories which ought not to mix, was the transgression of the sons of God. This is bolstered by the fact that elsewhere in the Bible, namely in Job and certain Psalms, the phrase Bnei Elohim really does seem to refer to supernatural beings. If elsewhere in the Bible it means supernatural figures, then that would be the most logical explanation of it here. This seems to be the interpretation that inspired passages in 1st Enoch, where there are angelic beings called watchers, which were intended to watch over humankind. But some of these beings began to lust after women and generated the Nephilim. First Enoch, in a sense, expands on this rather short account in Genesis 6. And Jude and 2 Peter both seem to be familiar with First Enoch and appear to reference it, which may bolster this interpretation of the sons of God being angelic figures, since Jude and Peter ostensibly accepted First Enoch's reading of Genesis 6. And other scholars have pointed to the tradition of the Apkallu and Mesopotamian tradition, the so-called sages who taught humanity the gifts of civilization, as a sort of parallel to the B'nai Elohim. Later understandings of the Apkallu appear in Neo-Assyrian wall reliefs and appear as winged figures with either bird, human, or fish heads. The Apkallu traditions seem somewhat aligned with those in 1st Enoch and have been cited in support of this reading. But against this reading is the fact that not all Christian groups see 1st Enoch as authoritative, and Jude, and by extension 2 Peter, may not be referencing this account in particular. Some scholars suggest that just because biblical passages use the phrase Ben Elohim to refer to angelic beings, they don't necessarily mean that's how it's used here, or it doesn't preclude other meanings in this context. There are other ways of reading this phrase.
Early Christian interpretation has read the sons of God to be descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men are the descendants of Cain. Now, this means the transgression was not the crossing of divine human boundaries, but the intermingling of the righteous line of Adam through Seth with the cursed line of Cain. This is how Augustine interprets it in his City of God. A problem with this reading is the difficulty of linking the daughters of men specifically with the line of Cain. Now, while the sons of God may be linked with those who follow God and his commands, and so plausibly with the line of Seth, it's really kind of a tenuous connection. Augustine seems to use this as a figural reading rather than one strongly supported by the text.
Jewish tradition also diverged from the angelic being interpretation to see the B'nai Elohim as human rulers of the ancient world. The biblical evidence to support this is that in a number of passages like Exodus 22, humans are referred to as Elohim. Most English translations will render Elohim here as judge, but the actual word is Elohim. In context, it's referring to a human, not a supernatural figure. We can also see God's relationship with Judah's ruler in particular, framed in terms of father and son, as in 2 Samuel 7. In this view, the transgression of Genesis 6 is perhaps promiscuity or polygamy on behalf of the rulers, or some kind of sexual oppressiveness against regular people. A problem with this reading is the fact that the charge against the B'nai Elohim is marriage, not general promiscuity, and the issue of polygamy has to be read into the text, so the transgression isn't clear just from reading the biblical data.
Now for the Nephilim. These are generally understood in one of two ways. One way is that they are the product of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men. This would make them either half angel, half human beings, humans from the intermixing of Seth's line and Cain's line, or the princes born of earthly rulers and regular women. The other option is that the Nephilim is a reference not to the product of these unions, but to a heroic age when these unions occurred, the age of the Nephilim. The Nephilim are described as mighty warriors, in Hebrew, Gibborim, a term also used to describe warriors like David and Jephthah. They're also called men of renown, meaning something like men of great name. Now, interestingly, the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, that renders Nephilim as giant. So, we can say this is at least indicates how the translators of the Septuagint understood the term.
Most modern interpretations are variations of these three views, particularly angelic and rulers models, but with some supplemental extra biblical evidence to support their views. And we aren't going to go through all of the possible options, but we'll examine a few that are more plausible or kind of interesting options. First is from the scholar Ronald Hendel. In an article titled Of Demigods and the Deluge, he makes a case for the Nephilim I find particularly interesting. He makes two key points about them. First, that they were originally understood as demigods, but also as a rhetorical device where they are meant for destruction. His argument goes briefly like this. The passage in Genesis 6 is short and confusing. Many scholars before Hendel have suggested that this is a truncated or abbreviated version of a pre-existing story. Hendel suggests the first 4 verses of Genesis 6 served as a prologue to the flood story and that they set the table for the justification of a so-called Yahwistic flood story. Most scholars maintain that the flood story in Genesis that we have is a fusion of the so-called Yahwistic and priestly flood accounts. The idea is that the two flood accounts existed independently within Israelite and Judahite society prior to the composition of Genesis. This accounts for the so-called doublets, or things that are repeated, and some elements which seemingly contradict each other in the received text. When Genesis was compiled, these two stories were fused together to make one more or less coherent story. The priestly source is decidedly non-mythic, while the Yahwistic one has, in Hendel's view, a more mythic background. In the Yahwistic source, the justification of the flood would have revolved around the Nephilim, supernatural beings, or the sons of God, intermingled with human women and generated demigod Nephilim. This is in line with the first, more ancient interpretation, where the transgression of the divine and human boundaries imposed by God is at the heart of the story. That transgression had to be resolved. And within Israelite tradition, there's a preoccupation with maintaining the order of God established at creation. The anthropologist Mary Douglas has recognized this in her study on the book of Leviticus. And the mixing of divine and human is a serious transgression of the proper order established by God, and in the Yahwistic tradition, as understood by Hendel, the flood was sent to put an end to this. Interestingly, Hendel cites both the Atrahasis story and the Greek poet Hesiod. In the Atrahasis story, the gods send a great flood because humanity multiplied and disturbed the rest of the gods. Humanity wasn't a rowdy neighbor keeping the gods up at night. Rather, humanity grew rebellious and disturbed the order established by the gods. The gods sent disease in order to limit their numbers, something perhaps paralleled in the limiting of humans' years in Genesis. But that was not effective enough, so the gods used a cataclysmic flood as their resolution to limit humanity. Similarly, Hesiod cites Zeus as being disturbed by the proliferation of demigods, and he determines to eliminate them. He instigates the Trojan War, which has a similar function to the flood narratives in the Near East in demarcating our time from prehistory. Zeus's plan is to have all the great warriors, or men of great name as it were, to fight in this great war and essentially kill each other off.
Hendel further notes the etymology of the word Nephilim. Now, while etymology can only take us so far, it's noteworthy that the root of Nephilim means something like to fall. Nephilim might thus be understood as the fallen ones. Now, this may refer to their status as progeny of rebellious or fallen divine beings, or, in Hendel's perspective, those who exist to be exterminated, that is, to fall. Hendel's perspective that the Nephilim are beings who exist to be defeated makes sense in the passages where we find them. In Genesis 6, they exist as the offspring of transgressed boundaries, and so are allotted for destruction in the flood. In Numbers, they exist to be killed by the people of Israel and by Moses. One possible reference to Nephilim in Ezekiel again emphasizes their destiny to die. Nephilim are fallen ones doomed to be destroyed by God's people according to God's plan. Nephilim exist to die. This makes them a rhetorical category more than anything else. Now, while not all scholars, particularly those with a source-critical emphasis, would agree with this interpretation, many certainly understand the Nephilim to be semi-divine offspring of supernatural figures and human women. Semi-divine figures are well known in ancient mythic sources. You're probably familiar with the Greco-Roman demigods like Heracles, Achilles, and Aeneas, who had divine parents. We also see Gilgamesh, perhaps the best known and most broadly known ancient hero, was understood as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. That math has always confused me. The Gilgamesh story was known within Syria-Palestine. A fragmentary cuneiform tablet of the Gilgamesh epic was found at the site of Megiddo and is dated to the Late Bronze Age. Now, most scholars recognize that the authors of Genesis 1 through 11 in particular were familiar with a number of Mesopotamian stories, and so parallels with them should be expected. That's not to say Genesis 6 is identical to or even just a polemic against these stories, but it is to say that Genesis is set in the same kind of world as these stories. Demigods wandering the earth and getting into all sorts of trouble is a well-known motif in the ancient Near East, and that may have been in the mind of the author of Genesis 6.
But Gilgamesh was also an actual person. His name is on the Sumerian king list as a king of Uruk, and his name is mentioned in a number of other texts as well. As far as we can tell, he was an actual person who actually ruled in Sumeria, perhaps somewhere between 2800 and 2500 BC. So this gives some credence to the notion that the sons of God were thought of as human rulers. Gilgamesh was a human ruler, though he was later given semi-divine qualities. Gilgamesh was also an oppressive ruler, so much so that the people of Uruk cried out to the gods for relief. Part of what made him so oppressive seems to be him taking the daughters of the citizens. This has been interpreted as the so-called rite of first night, where the king would take the bride for the first night before her husband did, sort of think Braveheart. Or it could be that the king was forcing himself on the women of the city. Either way, he was incredibly oppressive, but also so strong that none could oppose him. This led to the people to beseech the gods for relief, and they in turn made Enkidu as an equal to Gilgamesh. And this part of the Gilgamesh story has been understood as a backdrop for Genesis 6. The sons of God took the daughters of men like Gilgamesh took the women of Uruk. The rulers were oppressive. And John Walton has espoused this perspective and has suggested the Nephilim are not the product of such unions, but instead are a chronological marker for when these unions occurred. The oppressive rulers did this during an old heroic age, the time when the Nephilim were on the earth. The Nephilim here are then understood as great warriors, semi-historic or mythic heroes. In this view, Nephilim are not mean fallen ones, but something more like those who fall on others, or those who oppress or prey on others. It's notable there's no indication in Genesis 6 that the Nephilim are anything other than great warriors or individuals famous for their exploits. Great stature is not explicitly mentioned in this text. If we see a parallel to Gilgamesh in this passage, then perhaps we can see gigantism, as Gilgamesh is said to be 11 cubits tall, or around 18 feet in our terms. But again, this isn't clear in Genesis. In Numbers, it seems the Nephilim are of great stature, but again, there are alternative ways of understanding this. The Septuagint translation of Nephilim as giants may be more telling of their interpretive framework than of what they would have originally been understood to be. So, where does that leave us? Who or what were the Nephilim?
Well, if that doesn't clear things up, then please accept our apologies. But seriously, I think that's part of the point we want to make here. There are a lot of possible interpretations of what the Nephilim are, but a definitive interpretation just isn't clear. We don't have enough in the text to have a solid, unassailable interpretation of what these beings were. I think the demigod interpretation is perhaps the most plausible, but I could be persuaded on the human ruler perspective. I think what's most important is something that the scholar Tremper Longman says. The one thing that is clear, and it contributes to the main message of the story, is that some kind of transgression takes place. Whoever the sons of God and the daughters of humans are, they should not be marrying and having children. It is this transgression that brings on God's wrath. The Nephilim, whatever they were originally understood to be, serve a rhetorical purpose. The passage of Genesis 6 has an important rhetorical role in the primeval history in Genesis 1 through 11 as part of a cycle of order and disorder, sin and judgment. Now, these chapters develop numerous themes, but two important ones are God's order and God's presence, and how those two are connected. Divine presence is given, then lost, then sought after, because life with God is better than life without God. Now, this primeval history can be divided into two sections, from creation to the flood, and from the flood to the Tower of Babel. Each section is divided into 10 generations, Adam to Noah and Shem, Noah's son, to Abraham. They each start with a disordered world that is then brought into order, followed by warnings and covenants being made. We see disorder entering the story, followed by curses. Then there are the ancestries, first of Adam and his descendants, and then of all the nations. Finally, the Nephilim story and the Tower of Babel story conclude each of these sections, and they serve as parallels, but also inversions of each other. In the Nephilim story, the gods come down to humanity and transgress the divine human boundary, whereas the Tower of Babel is made to ascend to heaven for humans to transgress this boundary. We can connect these two stories even further with semantic elements, like the Nephilim being men of renown, men of the name. And the builders of the Tower of Babel, well, they were wanting to make a name for themselves. In both accounts, the presence of God is what is sought. The sons of God came down to humans as a kind of divine presence, perhaps human kings or fallen supernatural beings, but their presence brought not order, but disorder. Humanity did not experience the ordered existence that the presence of the true God brings. And the same is true with the Tower of Babel. People sought the presence of God by going up to heaven and tried to create a kind of relationship with God that was different from the one God had intended. So perhaps we should then read the Nephilim story not to try to find giants and demigods, but instead as a reminder to pursue the true presence of God. It's a reminder that there are consequences for transgressing the boundaries established by God. Whether we see the Nephilim story as an account of angels generating demigods or corrupt and oppressive rulers, we can be reminded of the blessing that comes from the good order God established at creation and the blessings of being in God's presence. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out our references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe and check out our video on supernatural beings of the ancient Near East. Now, finally, if you want to support the work that we're doing, you can become one of our Beneath the Bible excavators through channel membership at the Join button on our homepage. For $5 a month, you'll get early access to each video we publish, and you'll get to be part of a monthly video call with us. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.